everyone, and welcome back. And please, before we do anything else, join me in wishing Andrew a very happy birthday. Happy birthday, Andrew.
Oh, thank you so much, Jane. It's really lovely to see you. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. It's good to see you guys too, but you know what I mean.
It's so awesome you want to do this on your birthday, Andrew.
Oh, well, I love doing this. I absolutely enjoy it. I can't speak for anybody else, but I certainly love it. And it's so great to be here. And I do love our conversations, Jane. Thank you so much.
And it's such great fun. And it's so great having people join in. Andrew, do you want to reveal which movies in plural we're doing today?
Yes, so we were talking about the next subject a while ago, and we decided we'd really want to do Titanic. We were looking at James Cameron's 1997 effort, and then it occurred to us that we should actually do a comparison with the other really famous Titanic movie, which is, of course, A Night to Remember from 1958. So we are going to be sort of running the two in parallel in a way, aren't we, Jane, and just see how the conversation goes.
And I think we realized, both of us, when we rewatched the two films, that they are very alike in many ways. There seem to be a lot of overlaps. But what's also interesting is that they, of course, made decades apart, and they have very different approaches to the story and the narrative. Back in the 50s, of course, there were still quite a lot of survivors of the actual Titanic disaster. And of course, in the 90s, less so, or maybe even no one at all. There must have been a few, I'm guessing, very old, still alive. But
Gosh, I think they'd have been very lucky if they were still going. I don't know, to be honest. Guys, if you know of any Titanic survivors who are still alive in 97, please tell us.
I'm not sure actually, but it meant, of course, you could do a different take on the narrative. And also times had changed and all of that. So we also approached narratives differently. And there were quite a bit of fictional elements coming in, which I'm guessing, Andrew, is also why some people felt a little ambivalent about the 1997 version and the fictional layer, perhaps especially the love story being put over it. And you and I discussed that a bit as well.
We did, yes. I mean, I ended up not minding the love story, but I was part of the group that believed that the film would have been amazing on its own right if Winslet and DiCaprio's characters had not been there at all. It still would have been a very compelling sea drama, and there were so many other people whose personalities they could have fleshed out and given more story to. So yes, it was a bit of a mixed reception with that main theme.
That's that. I felt the same way. It was fantastically made, from a technical perspective. I don't think anyone had ever had such a close up of the details of the ship. That was fantastic. And there's certainly nothing wrong with the performances or anything. But I think, given that Titanic in its own right is quite a drama, you don't really have to put sort of extra layers of narrative on top of it, maybe.
No, I agree. And I also think you have to be very careful when you take an event like that, and especially such a tragic event like that. If you are going to work a strand of fiction through, well, actually, I shouldn't say a strand because the two love interest characters, I will remember their names in a second, Rose and Jack.
Jack and Rose.
Yeah, they are actually the center of the storyline, and the rest of it kind of happens around them. And so you just have to be careful that you don't impact on your historical characters in a way that might not be proper, or might give a distorted perspective of the events you're portraying. I mean, some people might tell me that's a bit of a purist's outlook, and they would be right. But I think it's a worthwhile consideration when you do something like this.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're going to get into those sort of narrative choices along the way, Andrew. But I actually have a question I wanted to ask you with your background, and I've been thinking about how to word this because it might sound a little silly, but I thought, just to set the scene, if we try for just a second to look beyond the myth of the Titanic, this entire story of the unsinkable ship, and look at the actual vessel and sort of cut to the nitty gritty. But in all its, sort of, you can't say it's simple. It's not simple. But what kind of a vessel was she? And I guess what I mean is, what did the world at the time expect? Because obviously this was kind of an impressive piece of engineering in its own right.
Yes, that's right. So Titanic was part of a much larger family overall of transatlantic liners, and their main purpose at the end of the day, ever since the concept of the liner had been conceived, many decades before, was simply to provide a high speed connection across the Atlantic. That was their sole purpose, and in doing that, they served two main functions. One of which was passenger transfer and mail transfer. So, of course, the reason Titanic is prefixed RMS is Royal Mail Ship. So she's one of the privileged high speed ones that has the license to carry Royal Mail goods. And in terms of the types of passengers you get, the vast majority of the passengers would have been third class steerage. So it's very funny when we talk about the golden era of the great liner. You imagine really wealthy, glamorous people hanging out in first class lounges. Now that's very real, and they certainly were there. But they were only a tiny minority on a ship that would have carried hundreds and hundreds of people. Very broadly speaking, people who were not making it in Europe for whatever reason, and who were attracted by the promise of a better life in the United States. And there was a lot to attract. The United States, they'd finished their coast to coast expansion, but they were still filling out the middle bits. So there were jobs, there were opportunities. There was, and also this sense that they would be freer in the United States. It was a much more democratic republic than most European republics, and certainly more, a wider voting franchise than most of the European monarchies. So if you were a person of that social order, there was a lot to attract you. In terms of the ship herself, Titanic was a technological marvel. Much was made of her size, which I find quite amusing because she was part of a class of three. There was Olympic, Titanic, and then her later sister, Britannic. Titanic was only a couple of feet longer than her nearly identical sister, Olympic. But, it's still bigger, and it still sets a new standard in size. And it's very much a part of the thinking at the time that, in a way, big is better. If you can build it bigger, it must be a bit better. She was certainly fast. She could make 24 knots or nearly 30 miles an hour and sustain, which is good speed in 1912. So you had a big, reliable ship, lots of passenger capacity, embodying all the latest technology. And many of the people who survived the experience of being part of Titanic's crew, and quite a few of her passengers who'd been on both Titanic and Olympic, said that she definitely set a new level of luxury. Olympic was a luxurious ship, but Titanic just took it to a whole new level.
Oh,
So yeah, that's pretty much her in a nutshell, really.
that's a fantastic overview, Andrew. And you touched on it as well there. We get an impression in both films about just how different the classes were, the level of luxury on the first class. And as you rightly say, there were lots of immigrants from all over Europe that tried to make it to America. Also on Titanic, I know quite a few Irish immigrants as well. And Ireland was at this time, and many places in Europe as well, really seriously poor.
Yeah. Yeah, poor people in Ireland had a really rough time since the middle of the 19th century, and things had not really got much better in rural areas, particularly. There was a lot of opportunity in the cities. If you were a skilled worker in the cities, you'd have a much better chance. But the life of the Irish farmer was really, really tough. And also dependent on good harvest. There's all the folk memories of the potato blights and the great famine of the 1850s. And so, yes, you're right. Loads of the passengers were Irish. I think there was one of the survivors. Kate Gillan. I think she'd made friends with two other Kates, a very common Irish first name. And there was one village, I forget where it was. Again, guys, remind me if you know. There was one village in Ireland that sent 14 or 15
Yes.
people on the Titanic.
Good you mentioned that because right now there is a documentary on Netflix actually about those 14.
Is
Uh,
there?
I
Okay, I'll
haven't
look
I
that up.
haven't seen it yet. I just saw a little clip and I cannot remember the name of the village either. But interestingly, and again, this was, as you say, Andrew, one of those poor societies. Those 14 knew each other and had been encouraged very much to go by someone who actually made it to America and came back to pick up her niece to go with her to America. And she, of course, came back with lots of stories, and she was doing pretty well.
Yeah.
Told everyone about the prospects and everything that was going really well in the US. So she actually picked up a little group of 14 people from this village, and they traveled together. Um, so that was really, I'm looking forward to watching that actually. I think it's like 50 minutes long or something, but that could be really interesting. And they look into especially letter correspondences
Okay.
between people in this village who know someone in the States. And remember, at the time, almost every family knew someone who had immigrated.
Yes, and it makes it all the more tragic because I can't remember the exact figures, but I think of the 14 who went, only less than five survived the sinking. So it was a horrific swathe cut through this community.
Yeah. I don't know why the number three came to mind, but maybe I've read that somewhere. I think three survived. It was really tragic and very telling for what happened overall.
Mm.
But yeah, you're right, Andrew. And I think that's actually a fantastic view in both films into the social classes there. And as we talked about, you can also see where James Cameron's found a lot of his inspiration because there's scenes that almost overlap in the two. But
Yes.
you do get a sense of, first of all, the differences between especially first class and steerage, but also in a way there is a seriousness to the first class that when you go down to the third class, there's sort of partying and musing and happy days going on. And there was really a sense that, we're looking forward to this. We are happy. We're traveling to better times, and things are now going to turn out fine for us all.
Yes, yes, it's very much the difference in circumstance, as you say, and I do find Jack's line very memorable when he says to Rose, "So you want to go to a real party?" and yes, because I suppose if you're an extremely wealthy passenger and you're doing this either for fun or for business, and Rose, I think, makes the observation that oh, don't worry, Cal will be ages because he'll be in there with the others drinking brandy and smoking cigars and congratulating themselves on being kings of the world. And yeah, it's a very different universe. Yes, but you're right about the upbeatness because I think a lot of the third class survivors who mentioned it, and I think the survivor named Kate was one of them, said there was this very upbeat feeling, and all the talk was about what they wanted to do when they got to America, what they hoped for, whether they had family there, where in the country they might end up. It was, yeah, very, very optimistic and lots of fun.
Yeah. No, true. And it just adds to, the tragedy of all of this. But I actually do think that both films in their own way manage to capture that difference. And I guess one good thing about the fictional character, for example, someone like Jack, is this sort of rootless existence where he travels from place to place and finds work wherever he can, and maybe it leads him to Europe, maybe it leads him back to the States, but in a way he is very carefree, perhaps a bit more so than people would have been in that class. But it does, kind of highlight the contrast between him and this very rich girl who is kind of captured in her role there.
Mm.
So I guess one thing that fictional story does show us is the limitations as well as the privileges that comes with first class, as well as um, the freedom, but at the same time, you are probably less carefree as Jack had you come from that kind of class.
Yes, you're expected to live in a more correct way, and particularly if you're one of the ladies. The one I really like, both historically and in terms of how they portray her in the film, is the so-called unsinkable Molly Brown, who, in a way, she has the best of both worlds because
Yeah.
she new money, new
Yes.
money. Oh dear God! So she brings all the attitudes of the hard-bitten, working slash middle class, and this sort of jolliness about her, which is a bit more natural. And also, I love that she doesn't care what other people
Yeah.
think,
Yes.
because at the end of the day, she's absolutely stinking rich, so she
Yes.
doesn't have to care.
She,
And if the people with titles and slightly less money look down their nose at her, it's like, well, whatever.
yeah. Yeah, let them. And I think what's also wonderful about her is that she's clearly learned to play the game. She knows how to interact with the first class as well, and she is
Mm.
not in any way arrogant about it because she doesn't really need to be anymore. She says she's got money anyway, so roll your eyes or whatever you need to.
Yeah, yeah. So she's that lovely bridge, and also in a world where there, as you said, there really was not that much social mobility. She's one of these people who's made it, and has managed to struggle her way up there.
Yeah, yeah, true. Oh, that's a good point. Um, and I was actually wondering because you did such a good job giving us an overview of Titanic there and what she was and what people expected from her and all of that. Um, if we try to go through the events that happened leading up until the iceberg collision and because it's very well covered in both films and via historical sources, but there's also
Mm.
some doubt about all those many things that actually went wrong along the way, not just the actual collision, but also the delayed kind of SOS response, also the entire mismanagement around getting people in the boats. There are so many things that just seem to go completely out of the window in all of this in terms of protocol. How much of this do we know from historical sources, and how much of this might have been in movies is saturated a bit?
It's difficult to say. I mean, in terms of overall protocols, the slightly tragic thing is, in many respects, the people on Titanic, the crew, didn't actually do much that was wrong in terms of the procedures at the time, because the things we take for granted today, like regular lifeboat drills, there was no national legislation or nothing that would resemble today's national legislation about how you should do this, and it was really up to individual companies to form their own policy. So in terms of the long-term problems, because of course the other big one, which we know, is the lack of lifeboats, there was a formula at the time, which was used throughout the British Merchant Marine, where you calculated the number of lifeboats you needed based on the tonnage of the ship, which is weird because, there's nothing to do with the number of people aboard. It's a factor of your ship's displacement. Um, and actually, to be fair to Cunard, they equipped the ship with more lifeboats than was required under the formula. So they actually thought they were being extra careful. It was only when the Titanic disaster that reveals the horrific inadequacy of that people go, oh,
Mm.
everyone on the ship should have a place in a boat. Logical. Let's do that from now on. And it seems so blindingly obvious to us now, but I suppose no one could have really conceived a disaster of that magnitude. It always takes a disaster to bring
Yeah.
about change, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of the ship's own reactions, or the crew's own reactions, there is the very, I won't go into it too much because it's been so well covered, but Titanic was traveling at a very high speed.
Mm.
Her crew were, they had a lot of experienced men, not least Captain Smith, who, to be fair, was not on duty on the bridge at the time. had been in the game. They'd done this job a long time, but Titanic was traveling at a very high speed, and a ship like that doesn't turn quickly. So between the sighting of the iceberg, the bridge getting the warning, ringing down to the engine room and ordering the reverse, it simply takes too long. So you could argue that there was an inherent problem there that should have perhaps with hindsight be recognized, but hindsight is a gorgeous thing.
Both of those scenes where you see that response time, they actually done really well in both movies, because you do get you do sit there and go, why the devil isn't anything happen? Turn, for goodness sake, turn, and that is, apart from being a wonderful dramatic moment for a viewer, but it's actually done really well in both movies.
Yes,
But
it is, and actually, funnily enough, I prefer the way it's done in Cameron's film. I don't know whether it's just because everything's in color, or
but
or perhaps in contrast to the 1950s film, you get just that little bit more sense of human
yeah,
panic, because everyone's quite stiff upper lip in the 50s one, but yeah, you get more of the panic, and inertia's a cruel mistress,
yeah.
unfortunately. Yeah, and as for the raid,
And to go on. Sorry, I
oh,
interrupted.
sorry, no,
Go
no.
on, go
I,
on.
I'll only touch on the radio side before I hand back. So wireless communications, it had been on ships for more than a decade by the time Titanic sank, but it was still more, well, as much an art as a science, and a lot depended on atmospheric conditions and the strength of your transmitter. Titanic's wireless had been overloaded that day with message, and people make a lot about that sixth ice warning probably never
Yes.
getting to Captain Smith.
Yeah.
Um, and you just find that you can send a message, and a ship closer to you may fail to pick it up, and a ship further away might get it sooner than you do. So, of course, Carpathia gets it loud and clear.
Mm.
But admittedly, because their radio operator went off duty, the much closer Californian doesn't get it. So it's quite tragic that. Titanic, of course, has the dubious distinction of being the first ship to start transmitting an SOS in a life-threatening emergency. Because before that, it was CQD, which I think was Come Quick Danger. Yeah, but you're absolutely right, Jane. There's so much to go into, but essentially, it's not one single thing that really
Yeah.
dooms the Titanic. It's lots of little things coming together at the wrong time and the wrong place that causes this.
It's a fantastic point, Andrew. I also think maybe that there is one scene I've been thinking about. It's actually probably the one scene I like the best from the '97 Titanic. It's one thing is when something has happened, like an iceberg collision, but you also have to realize the level of danger that you are now in, and that's not quite the same. And
Hmm.
I actually love how we get to see that in both films as well. There are two wonderful scenes as well, where especially Mr. Andrews there comes with his drawings, and he's trying to explain, that so and so many compartments, and one after the other. She can stay afloat with four, but not five. And he's trying to explain this. And I know they in Titanic made Ismay sort of the villain, if that's the correct word, but he's a little bit, pushy. But that's a wonderful, wonderful line where he's trying to explain all of this, and Ismay is in the back, sort of going, "When can we get on the way?" And when they realizes the horror of the situation, he sort of goes, "But the ship cannot sink." And Mr. Andrew goes, "She's made of iron." And I love that line, because what he's doing there is effectively puncturing the myth that's kept this boat up there on a level where, of course, we're not going to sink. It's a Titanic. We're not going to sink. Um,
Yeah.
but I love that little exchange there, because this is now logic. She's made of iron. She's going to sink, and we go.
Yes. Yeah.
Of course, we're going down.
Yeah.
It's such a wonderful little dramatic exchange there. But I'm just wondering as well. Of course, we don't know how those conversations took place, but uh, there is there is a difference between something happening, a danger happening, and then you realizing and getting that message across to people that this is serious. And
Yes.
there must have been a time between the panic started to really seep into everything, but both crew and passengers, of course.
Yes, I think the crew were you're absolutely right. They were more aware of the seriousness of the situation beforehand. Although a couple of the survivors said even they didn't quite believe it until quite late. In fact, there's one guy who was asleep in his bunk. He got up after the crash. He went forward to the anchor chain locker, and he could see water rising and he could hear air escaping. But even then, he kind of thought, no, it's Titanic. And he went back to his bunk for a bit because he was off duty. So it was like, there's this air of unreality. But you're right with the crew. And I think, again, the 97 film captures this quite beautifully when the stewards are knocking on doors saying, you've got to put your life jackets on. And all the people are going, oh, this is ridiculous. And I think Cal even says, oh, damn British, always doing things by the book. I'm sure it's something really minor. Is this really necessary? And it's really the third class, as it was on the night, who get the first inkling of the danger. I love how the character, I think it's Jack's friend Fabrizio, gets out of bed and there's already water
Yeah.
sloshing around the floor. So, okay, this is bad. That's not meant to be happening. And they do capture the difference in how people are warned quite well. And it's the only thing I worry. There was a slightly snooty thing going on where, in first and second class, it's a polite knock on the door, and whereas in third, it's like, get your life belts on. There you go. But a reason for that was efficiency as well,
Yeah.
because there were so many more third class passengers. If you politely knocked on all the doors and said, "I'm terribly sorry," you'd be there. You'd still be doing it when the ship hit the
Yeah.
bottom of the
Yeah.
sea. So they had to move quicker,
Yeah.
and also because the third class was so much more at risk because the water was
Yeah.
rising in that area. Um, it doesn't excuse the later snafus where the third class are basically held back from the boats, but it was a very real consideration in terms of alerting them at the time.
Yeah. No, it's actually done really well. I also, this is just a slightly side note, but I do like that we get in a sense of how many different nationalities were on board, because I think they share cabin with, well, his friend there is Italian, but I think they share cabin with two Swedish guys as well. And you actually, I love how they do actually speak Swedish. And I remember one of them getting out of bed and into the water, and he goes, "Oh, herregud," which means something like, "Oh, dear God," or something in Swedish.
Oh, right. Okay.
I love that they actually let them speak Swedish, so you get a sense of the various nationalities on board. Um, but yeah, that it's really deep, that and oh, where was I going with this now?
I think you did. I didn't answer this when you raised it. You talked about the breakdown in the efforts to get passengers in the boats and how that whole system, I think it's too strong to say it completely fell apart, but it really did not go well either. And I don't know how you found it, Jane. I mean, from both the books about the disaster and from actually maybe more from the 1997 film than the 1950s one, you get this sense of people struggling to get a job done. And the officers know what they're doing, and a small number of sailors know what they're doing, but they're surrounded by a large number of people who are basically Titanic's hospitality
Yeah,
staff, who are
yeah,
they're not silly people, but they've never been trained to do this, and you're trying to organize them in a very stressful situation to try and get this process underway, and it's a situation where you don't want to have to be teaching people
yeah,
while you're trying to do it. And it's also just that you get that inconsistency where on Murdoch's side of the
yeah,
ship, which I think was the starboard side, the lifeboats go very quickly, but some of them are rather dubiously
yeah.
empty. And then on Lightoll's side, it takes ages, but he's taking a lot of care to fill the boats. But even then, he's being a bit too strict with the women and children only, and because you needed some men to
Yeah.
pull an oar or to cox the boats. So yeah, and there's just this. It gives this impression of chaos and the lack of an overall system.
And it also adds to as you said, Andrew, because there wasn't a strict protocol. It was very much up to the individual men to stay calm and not
Yeah.
panic. And then you're suddenly down to character.
Yes.
And I guess where A Night to Remember was there weren't sort of specific people, main characters you followed, but you got a very sort of accurate overview of events. And of course, they had the massive advantage of live, witnesses and stories, testimonials that could be given, and that
Mm.
certainly showed. But there were individuals that we don't really get to know, but we follow. Like, for example, you mentioned the man who got very drunk. In
Yes.
an attempt to survive, oh my God, we're in an emergency, right, whiskey, and weirdly, he kind of, it manages to keep him up, or at least, I guess what it manages to do is keep him separate from the panic in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe that was a good move. So what I love about him, we don't really get to know him, but what I love about him is that there are many ways to deal with panic, and you can't really say that one way is better than the other when you are in this kind of emergency. Um,
No, indeed not. Yes, you're absolutely right with that. Yeah, Baker Joan, I think his name was, and yes, and actually, one criticism I have of the 1997 Titanic is just because his story is so incredible.
yeah.
He deserved a couple more scenes than they actually gave him. I mean, in A Night to Remember, I love how they keep going back to him, wandering around, getting progressively more and more tipsy until the final moment. Whereas in Cameron's movie, you only see him right at the very end, where he's on the
Yeah.
rail and he and Jack and Rose are sort of looking at each other right before the ship goes down. Um, yes, yeah. That is something overall. You're right. A Night to Remember performs much better in terms of, I'll call it the drama documentary approach, because we're following real people,
Yeah.
and we are getting their stories firsthand as told. And although it must have been a bit traumatic for them, I really admire the approach where they actually got survivors of the Titanic to be advisors on set
Yeah.
while the film was being made. Because I know with the officers, it was the guy who actually first spoke to Captain Rostron on Carpathia. It was Boxall, wasn't it? He was actually one of the technical
Yeah.
advisors on A Night to Remember. Um, and I know Lawrence Beasley, one of the guys who wrote one of the accounts afterwards, he was very heavily involved in the film. And
It
about a dozen others, I think, at least, possibly
Yes,
more.
possibly more. It must have been, I don't know, either you find it strange or therapeutic at the same time. Uh,
Yeah.
because I think obviously you're going to be traumatized for life after something like this, but I think you're probably also marred by something like survivor's guilt for the rest of your life, when you don't know, do you? We don't know if unless you've actually been through something like this, but it must have been, or maybe you have a great need for this story to be told through
Yes,
yeah.
maybe it helps. It's, I mean, you're right about the effect on different people. I get the impression that people like Beasley, they bounced back very well. And in fact, I don't know how true it is. Someone told me a couple of years ago that during the filming of A Night to Remember, he wasn't meant to be in the film at all. But Beasley really wanted to be in a scene where the ship was about to take its final plunge, and he tried sneaking in among the extras, and he was spotted and told he had to go.
Oh,
And so they made him leave, and then someone made a quip about that's the second time you were able to leave Titanic before the ship sank.
that's really good. That's a good line.
Yeah, so dear old Beasley, but you rightly mentioned Bruce Ismay earlier, and the fact that he gets vilified as a bad guy, and I believe after Titanic he resigned very quickly
Yeah.
as manager of White Star, and he basically became a recluse after that. I think he just went back to his home and never saw anyone until his death, really.
I actually wanted, Andrew, to dive into some of the characters, the historical characters, a bit more with you. I was wondering if we should wrap up part one and then we can do characters in part two.
That would be a splendid idea. Yes, because you're right. We've been going on quite a while, and there's so much to say about all
Then
these
and then
fascinating
we could
people.
ask people to join in and comment on everything in part two, in part one that we've covered so far, and we've forgotten a lot, guys. So please do join in.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much to say about this incredible ship and these two incredible movies. So please do join in the conversation, set us straight. Maybe even float up something that we've not thought about. All everything's welcome, guys.
And we'll see you in part two.
Yes, Jane, thank you so much for today. And I'm really looking forward to part two. Take care.